After signing the START arms agreement, Mikhail Gorbachev headed south to the Crimea for his summer holidays. But no sooner had he arrived than the airport was closed and warships stationed near his dacha, which was surrounded by KGB troops, and the nation awoke to the news that a state of emergency had been declared, that Gorbachev was too unwell to rule, and that a committee of 8 men headed by Deputy President, now Acting President, Gennady Yanayev was now in charge. It was a coup d'etat, and soldiers and tanks took to the streets. However, the plotters had somehow failed to arrest Boris Yeltsin, who based himself in the Russian Parliament building, the White House, and began rallying opposition to the coup. In Moscow and Leningrad there were huge protests, and condemnation of the coup swiftly followed from both the US and European community, and internally from several leaders of other Soviet republics. Eventually, an abortive attempt to storm the Parliament building resulted in the death of 3 civilians, which seemed to take the wind out of the army's sails, and the whole coup crumbled by the end of the 3rd day. The plotters were arrested, and Gorbachev returned to Moscow on the 22nd of August. During the chaos, though, the ruling Supreme Councils of both Estonia and Latvia had declared their full independence from the Soviet Union, and crucially the Icelandic government recognised all 3 Baltic states, including Lithuania, on the 22nd of August. 2 days later, there was a double blow as both the Ukrainian and Belarusian republics, along with Russia, the 2 most populous and powerful in the Union, declared their own independence from the USSR. The previous day, in a symbolic gesture, the Russian Republic had changed its flag from the Soviet flag with the blue bar that it had used since 1954 to the old white, blue, red tricolour. And on Sunday the 25th of August, the date of the Belgian Grand Prix, the low-level ethnic clashes in Croatia erupted into open civil war. The Yugoslav National Army, the JNA, came in to support ethnic Serb militias within Croatia who didn't want to separate from Yugoslavia, and launched a full-scale offensive in eastern Slavonia, targeting the lightly defended city of Vukovar using aircraft, tanks, artillery and even naval shell fire from the Danube flotilla. The city was quickly cut off and surrounded, but the JNA was too reliant on tanks which couldn't operate in the narrow streets, and was unable to take the city itself, beginning a siege that would go on until November. Before that all kicked off, Southwark Court in London had found time to hear the case of Bertrand Gachot over his use of banned CS gas in an altercation with a London taxi driver back in December. Although as a first-time offender and a foreign national he had expected a fine and a slap on the wrist, he was stunned when he was given a £500 fine and 18 months in prison. The London Cab Drivers Union had pushed for an exemplary sentence in the high-profile case, and the court noted that his defence that he hadn't known CS gas was illegal in the UK was somewhat undermined by the fact that he'd tried to dispose of the canister afterwards. With the whole of Belgium up in arms and saying some very unkind things about the British legal system, Eddie Jordan set about finding a replacement. In fact, Bertrand maintains to this day that Eddie did his best to get him banged up so he could justify ditching his contract and signing up someone else who would pay for the drive. But who? Eternal super sub Stefan Johansson was apparently in the mix, as was Italian F3000 Championship leader Alessandro Zanardi, but Mercedes competition director Jochen Nierpasch and manager Willi Weber were both keen to get their 22-year-old German protégé Michael Schumacher into F1, so with Johnny Herbert back in Lotus and Michael Bartels given his marching orders for the week, the Tic Tac funding switched to Jordan to pay Schumacher's 400,000 Deutschmark race fee. After a quick 4-lap test at Silverstone, and with Weber's assurances that Schumacher knew Spa, he'd actually never driven there, the deal was done. In fact, Eddie seemed impressed enough to offer Michael a contract to the end of the season, but Michael said they'd talk about that after the race. Car 32, Michael Schumacher. Born a little way outside Cologne, Michael was the son of a plumber, who added a motor to his pedal cart, then, when Michael crashed it into a tree, took him to a proper circuit. By age 6 he was a proficient karter, but couldn't get a German racing licence until 14, so he raced for 2 years from the age of 12 under a Luxembourg licence. At which point he exploded onto the national scene, moving quickly into Formula Ford and Formula Koenig in 1988. In 1989 he signed with Willi Weber's WTS team in F3, but after winning the 1990 title and the prestigious Macau Grand Prix, Weber recommended taking the unusual move of entering the World Sports Car Championship season, to get him used to top-level pressure, press conferences and so on, rather than taking the usual route through F3000 to Formula 1. If Eddie had thrown his driver under the bus for financial reasons, it wasn't unprovoked. Success costs money and they were running out of it. A few days before the race, a bailiff showed up to seize equipment to pay off a debt of 7.5 million Belgian francs Eddie had taken to give Philippe Adams a drive in F3. The deal had fallen through, but Eddie still hadn't actually paid back the money. Adams sued and won, hence the bailiffs. Bernie Eccleston lent Jordan the money, which he in turn borrowed from the gate receipts from the upcoming race, and just to put the tin hat on it, Jordan had had a request for the latest Evolution Ford engine turned down, and there were rumours that Benetton were leaning on Ford to cancel the deal altogether at the end of the year. Jordan weren't the only ones with engine woes either. Brabham and Yamaha were parting ways, with the Middlebridge group having either been unable or unwilling to stump up the money for development. In fact, Brabham were even being turfed out of their own factory at Chessington because it was only being rented to them and it had just been sold to Yamaha. And Giancarlo Minardi admitted that he just hadn't found enough sponsorship to pay Ferrari for their engines and he wouldn't be able to keep running them in 1992. The Scuderia Italia team were rumoured to be measuring their engine bay, checking their balance sheet and making some thoughtful noises. Further down the pit line, things were going sour at Benetton too. Flavio Briatore had turned down a demand from Nelson Piquet for $7 million for next year, feeling that at 39 the triple champion was past it and had lost his motivation. And so on Thursday, as the teams were setting up, Nelson walked down the pit lane with his agent and asked Guy Ligier if he was hiring. No answer as yet, though Guy had a big grin on his face that his team could still attract such a high-profile driver. But both Boutsen and Comas had contracts for 1992, and what about Prost? He'd made it clear that he wasn't interested in a simple driving deal, but with an eye on retirement was angling after a management or maybe even joint ownership role. Nice problems to have, as they say. Back at Benetton, it was looking obvious that a disillusioned Piquet would be on his way, so Flavio Briatore offered a pre-contract to an equally disillusioned Ivan Capelli, though he was said to really want a bigger name. Roberto Moreno was evidently also not long for the team, regarded as solid but too deferential to Piquet and just without the attack and aggression needed. New stakeholder Tom Walkinshaw had a long history with Martin Brundle and rated him very highly, so that could be an option. It's exhausting this silly season like, isn't it? Shall we do some racing? Let's do some racing. Pre-qualifying on Friday saw the Brabhams top again, with Brundle comfortably ahead of Blundell this time, with Grouillard third again, and Alex Caffey finally squeaking in for the first time, while Alboreto failed for the first time after having 2 punctures. Barbazza had a big off during the session, although he was fine, but was slowest of all, much to the relief of Chavez and the Coloni team, even if it was only by default. On to qualifying proper then, with the circuit full of messages of support for Bertrand Gachot. His fiancée Kate Palmer had had T-shirts printed up reading "God Save the British" and Gachot, and the pithier "Gachot, why?" Bert himself had said that the car was feeling so good in Hungary that he thought he had a shot of pole in Belgium. We would now never know, both Jordans ran well on Friday without really threatening the top drivers. Everyone improved their times on Saturday, except Berger, who blew 2 engines, and Patrese, who was having back problems and whose times were scrubbed after scrutineers found his car had no reverse gear. It was Ayrton Senna again who was fastest both days to take pole once more, with Berger's engine woes dropping him from 2nd on Friday to 4th on Saturday. Patrese was dropped down to 17th on the grid, so Alain Prost got an all-too-rare these days front row start, with Mansell 3rd, and behind Berger were Alesi and Piquet. Then in 7th place, the Jordan of young Schumacher, pretty impressive at his first look at the circuit in his first race. He'd lined up alongside Roberto Moreno in the second Benetton, with Martini making the most of Ferrari power while he had it in 9th, and Modena 10th in the Tyrrell Honda. Andrea de Cesaris was 11th in the other Jordan, about 7/10 off his new teammate, alongside possibly Benetton-bound Capelli. The Brabhams were 13th and 16th. Patrese had an unexpected reunion with Thierry Boutsen, 18th in the Ligier, which he pronounced undrivable, and the Loti were looking a bit better too, with Herbert 21st and Hakkinen 24th. Gouillard got his Von Metal into the race this time in 23rd, with Comas in the second Ligier bringing up the rear, alongside Pirro, who came down to earth with a bump after qualifying 7th in Hungary thanks to a series of engine failures. Suzuki, by just 100th, Caffey and both Lambos missed the cut, with Paul van der Poel slowest of all in his home race, the car much better on slow tracks than the high-speed blasts due to its lack of ground effect. So in the end, Thierry Boutsen would be the only one to carry the Belgian flag, as an unexpected burst of patriotism was swelling around the track. Ironic, really, as Gachot himself was a proud pan-European and had only started racing under a Belgian licence to please his old sponsor Jean-Pierre Van Rossum. At any rate, local touring car driver Pascal Whitmer hired an F3000 car from the Krypton team for the support race, running with free Gachot on the side and his helmet, and was given the drive for free by team owner Patrizio Cantu, also owner of AGS. And track officials arrived on Sunday morning to find someone had written "Gachot, Belgium is with you, you are not a hooligan" in French on the track at Eau Rouge. There were more than a few Gachot Y t-shirts in evidence at the driver's briefing, and free Gachot stickers appearing on the F1 cars too, and there was even talk of the drivers mounting a grid protest until Jean-Marie Balestre firmly knocked that one on the head. The Williamses were quickest in the Sunday morning warm-up, though it might not do Prix much good down in 17th, and the sun was shining on the usual huge crowd as they all lined up to take the start. And off they went, with Senna holding his lead as they streamed round La Source, chased by Prost, Mansell, Berger, Piquet and Schumacher. But as they went through La Source and climbed up to Les Combes, the débutante's race was over already. He'd burned out his clutch, and that was that. So Senna led Prost and Mansell through the infield section, while Piquet had got ahead of Berger into fourth, with Alesi and the other Ferrari hanging closely onto the McLaren's tail. Behind the top six were Modena 7th, De Cesaris up to 8th in the other Jordan, followed by Moreno and Capelli in 10th. On the climb out of La Source on lap 2, Mansell pulled ahead of Prost into second. Thanks to their warm-up times, most pundits thought Mansell was the favourite to win today, despite coming from third on the grid. But whether Nigel had got past on sheer pace was called into question when next time around Prost retired with a smoking engine. A broken fuel pipe had caused a lively but non-threatening fire. Mansell put his foot to the floor and motored up behind Senna, while Patrese, mostly unseen, was on a banzai charge and made his way up past Capelli into 9th place. Nakajima was the next retirement when dicing for 19th place with Morbidelli and simply threw it off. "My fault, sorry," he said afterwards. Nice that he's honest about it, but Ken Tyrrell has to wonder if he's not already retired in his own mind. All the time, Mansell was following Senna closely, putting pressure on him and trying to get close enough to pick up a tow through Eau Rouge, but on lap 15, about a third distance, Senna peeled in for tyres as both came up to lap Comas. A slight problem on his right rear slowed the stop, but he would be hoping that Mansell would be delayed getting past Ligier, and it would all even out. The McLaren was spat out back onto the track in front of De Cesaris and Patrese, now scrapping over 6th, and indeed De Cesaris was soon right on Senna's tail, keen to take advantage of his cold tyres. After a certain amount of marginally acceptable dodging and weaving, Senna stayed ahead, but there was now a tight 3-car group in 5th, 6th and 7th places. Piquet came in from second, another slow stop, and then it was Mansell in from the lead, setting fastest lap on his in-lap. The Williams team turned him round in 7.4 seconds, giving him an effective advantage of over 2 seconds on Senna when it all shook out, and Mansell rejoined third between Berger and Alesi, and soon enough he was passing the Austrian who was on his way in. Another sticky wheel, this time his front left, meant a dreadful 17-second stop, a problem compounded when he tried too hard to get on the power and spun at the pit exit, and was very nearly T-boned by Stefano Modena on his own way out of the pits. By half distance, lap 22 then, Mansell led Alesi, with Senna third, then Piquet, Patrese and De Cesaris, the second Williams having finally got past the Jordan after the tyre stops. The top three were running right together, Alesi on a non-stop strategy again, and suddenly the Ferrari was surging past Mansell into the bus stop chicane. Senna quickly followed, and Mansell went round to start the next lap but was already going slowly on the way down to Eau Rouge. He never made it to the famous corner, parking up with a gearbox failure. So with half the race still to go, Alesi was now leading. The question was whether he could stay there as those harder tyres wore, or whether he'd decide to come in for fresh, softer ones. Häkkönen's engine gave out when the Finn was in an excellent 10th place, and something seemed to be up with Senna's car too. Alesi was suddenly pulling away and Piquet in third was closing, with Patrese close on his heels too. In fact, Ayrton had had a gearbox malfunction, it had selected second instead of fourth, and he'd had to lay off the throttle while he found the right gear and was quickly back on the pace again. But the damage was done. Alesi was off in the lead by 11 seconds, while Senna had a train of Piquet, Patrese and De Cesaris right in his wheel tracks. There was some respite for Senna though, because Piquet was having to concentrate more on the Williams behind him than the McLaren in front. On lap 30, Patrese went for it, only to miss his braking point into Kemmel, bounce through the gravel and rejoin behind De Cesaris. The following lap, heartbreak for Alesi, who must have scented his first Ferrari win, as a valve spring failed and his race evaporated in a cloud of engine smoke. While he was climbing out, De Cesaris attacked and overtook Piquet, going up to second place. So it was Senna leading, about 2.5 seconds ahead of the Jordan, with Piquet and Patrese still close behind, then Berger back up to 5th and Modena 6th. Patrese was harrying Piquet, both of them having dirty tyres. The Pirellis just seemed to pick up dirt quicker, and of course Patrese had had his bit of an impromptu motocross. Soon enough the Williams was past the Benetton for 3rd, as Modena fell by the wayside with an oil leak, parking up next to Mansell's Williams and Gugelin's Leightonhouse, an early casualty on lap 2, which promoted Moreno into the points. Scarcely able to believe what was happening, Eddie Jordan and the crew willed their man onwards as Andrea de Cesaris, a man with a point to prove after being outpaced by Schumacher in qualifying, chased Senna for the lead. Piquet soon had Berger going past 2, the Austrian with the bit well and truly between his teeth, making his way up to 4th. Senna was maintaining a lead of about 3 seconds over de Cesaris, who was now losing ground to his pursuers too. It was Andrea's 160th race, with 2 second places to his name, but he was the driver who'd had the most starts without a win. It honestly didn't look like he'd be going one step higher today, but he was certainly going to give it a good crack to see if he could add a 3rd runner-up spot, and you never know. Senna, for his part, was warily eyeing his left front tyre, which had got blistered, and took his time getting through the next batch of traffic, but on lap 42, just 2 before the end, it was all over for Jordan as Andrea's Ford V8 went up in smoke and he pulled off heartbroken. Frustration too for Patrese, after his magnificent comeback from 17th on the grid on the same lap as de Cesaris' retirement, the Williams gearbox started emitting smoke and he had to let Berger through. The next lap Piquet was also passed, and on the final lap Moreno too. Senna slowed up sufficiently that he led Gerhard Berger home in close formation for a McLaren 1-2 with a Benetton 3-4 behind them. Patrese trailed in 5th, with Mark Blundell scoring his first career point and Brabham's first of the year, a much-needed morale boost for the team and a fillip for their chances of avoiding PQ in 1992, but too late to save their Yamaha engine deal. Johnny Herbert was a fine 7th and the last man on the lead lap, followed by Pirot and Brundle, and Olivier Gouillard taking Fonmetal's first finish of the year in 10th. Local hero Boutsen trailed in last, with Martini and de Cesaris also classified having gone far enough. Andrea made his way back to the Jordan garage, but sat there just dumbfounded, without even the strength to get out of his race suit, while his boss let out a string of Irish invective, not at Andrea, but at the gods of racing, and possibly at Mike Cranafus of Ford, who denied him that new engine. As Senna, Berger and, eventually, Piquet took to the podium, it had been a great weekend for McLaren and a catastrophic one for Williams, with Mansell now 22 points behind in the Drivers' Championship with 5 races to go, and Williams 16 behind in the Constructors. The season had started with McLaren dominance, then the pendulum had swung towards Williams, and now it seemed to have swung back towards Woking. Another dire weekend for Ferrari and a great one for Benetton also saw the prancing horse now in danger of losing their 3rd place, and Mark Blundell's maiden point saw the tally of drivers scoring points rise to a ridiculous 21 and the number of teams to 12. Next up was the Italian Grand Prix at Monza, where the Williamses were predicted to go well, and the fans would be happy enough with a win for Il Leone if the red cars were having their usual nightmare. Eddie Jordan, meanwhile, had to regroup his team from their disappointment and get his new star Schumacher to put pen to paper on that contract they'd been talking about.